Hello, I am Stephen Haber, the Peter and Helen Bing Senior Fellow at the Hoover Institution. Welcome to our latest installment of the Hoover Book Club, where we bring Hoover Fellows and friends together to discuss their latest writings. Today, we will discuss The Battle Over Patents, History and the Politics of Innovation, a book I edited with Naomi Lamoureux, the Stanley B. Resser Professor of Economics of History at Yale University. We are joined by two contributors to that book, Hoover Research Fellow and Senior Fellow at the Universidad Adolfo Ibáñez, Alex Galetovic, and Gerardo Con Diaz, Associate Professor of Science and Technology Studies at UC Davis and former Hoover National Fellow. So first, let me welcome Gerardo and Alex. I'm delighted you're here. I'll say by way of preamble how much I enjoyed working with you guys on the 3 years that we worked on this book. And I'd like to start out with a sort of an open-ended question to give listeners a sense of what the book is about. There has been a debate over the last, let's say, 15 years or so about the value of patents. And one view of patents, and I'm going to paint these fairly starkly, is that they're essential for the process of innovation, and that if we didn't have them, we'd have a lot less innovation because there wouldn't be a property right in ideas. The second view, the alternative view, is that patents are actually an impediment to innovation because they create monopolies and thereby discourage follow-on technologies. Given that background, Alex, why don't we start with you? Given that background, could you say some words about what role did patents play in the specific area you focused on, which was the history of semiconductors, which for those of us in Silicon Valley is sort of say the history of our backyards. Let me give you the floor, and then I'm going to ask Con to talk about patents in software. Alex.
Thanks, Steve. One can the story or the history of the semiconductor industry is fascinating, and at the same time, it's a continuous development of 70 years, which has more or less the same structure, which is the development or the implication or the playing out of Moore's law, which allows better and better components to be produced, and so that the electronics gets better and better and can do more and more things with semiconductors. And at the same time, of course, enormous change and creativity, which is how semiconductor firms live the day to day. I mean, they are in a constant threat, tension between threats, competitive threats, and opportunities to develop new technologies. And one can think of the role of patents in two periods. The first period runs from more or less the early 1950s to the late 70s, in which the basics of the technology was developed, and in which semiconductors were produced essentially by specialist firms who would develop devices which were differentiated, and in which patents played an interesting role. It was, to some extent, some firms derived revenues from those patents because they licensed. Licensing is something that emerged in the industry very early on in the 1960s. But essentially, the most important thing perhaps is that patents allowed firms to manage an inherent tension in semiconductor firms. Semiconductor firms tend to be very specialized. They develop one product, and that's part of the reason why technological progress has been so fast, is that new products are developed by startups which are very focused on one innovation. But that puts a very interesting tension, which has been stressed by Gordon Moore of Moore's law fame, who argues that semiconductor firms always have far more ideas than what they can handle. And the outcome of this is, we see that in the history of the industry, is that people leave semiconductor firms all the time to start a new venture. Now, patents played among their many roles. They played especially during the first part of the industry until the late 1970s. They played a very interesting role in managing this tension, because you could leave a firm provided that you wouldn't run with the idea that the firm was developing, which was protected by patents.
So you're saying that the firm held the patent, and so you couldn't appropriate the firm's technology if you left the firm, and that allowed engineers to move from one firm to another fairly seamlessly.
Right. Not only the technology, but the product that they were working on. Mm-hmm. That was very important. Firms were specialized. They focused on one narrow subset of products, and they would develop those products, and you would leave, and both trade secrets and patents would prevent you from leaving and copying whatever the firm was doing. But most of the time you were free to leave if you would leave to start a new venture doing something else. One of the fascinating aspects of this is, if you look at the history of the industry, you see rates of total factor productivity, which are unique. I mean, there is no other industry which has produced consistently such rates of total factor productivity, which we economists know is manna from heaven. And partly, and the mechanics of this total factor productivity and free lunch was that people would learn much more than what was useful for any given firm. And they could leave to start a new firm using the new knowledge, or some other firm could use your knowledge, provided that firm wouldn't copy your product.
Okay, let me turn now to Con. What I thought was fascinating about your chapter in the book on software is that there's now a lot of skepticism about whether software can even be patentable, whether it constitutes patentable subject matter. So my prior would have been, before reading your chapter, that patents played no role in the development of software. So I wonder if you could sort of enlighten our guests, our listeners, as to in the early years of the industry, what role did patents actually play in the emerging software industry? And then I want to sort of create some tension between you and Alex, if I can. Friendly tension, mind you. Con, the floor is yours.
In the early days of the software industry, patents were essential for small firms to start trying to compete with the larger ones. So one of the big episodes in the history of software early on was what's called the bundling of IBM's software with its hardware. So essentially, IBM and other hardware manufacturers would distribute the software free of charge with the purchase or lease of hardware. And so what would happen is that if a small firm was trying to enter the computing industry by developing software products, they would need some way of asserting their dominance over at least the market for the product that they were hoping to release. And so that's what they did with the patents. It would allow them to create these small portions of the industry where they could try to compete with IBM's essentially free products without the fear that IBM would just suddenly start developing programs that perform the same functions or the same algorithms, and sort of essentially driving out of business even as soon as they arrived. And so early on, patents were just sort of this rallying cry for these tiny software firms that were basically made up of former hardware manufacturing employees who decided that with a notepad and a pencil, they could perhaps enter the industry and make a name for themselves.
So I'm now very confused because both you and Alex have been advancing this idea that patents benefited small firms, startups, inventors who were in one firm and left for another firm. Maybe I've got it wrong, but my understanding from much of the literature about patents, at least in the last 15 years, particularly the literature that comes out of law schools, is that what patents do is they grant monopolies. So how can it be that something that grants a temporary monopoly is actually beneficial to small firms and startups? Because I don't usually think of the words monopoly, small firm, and startup all being in the same sentence. So what are the patents doing? So either they're not creating monopolies, or I don't understand what monopolies are.
As a matter of fact, they don't create monopolies, or most of the time, they don't create monopolies. If by monopoly, we mean the technical, what an economist means by a monopoly, who confronts a demand curve and can set the price by fixing the quantity, or fix the price and set the quantity. What actually happens is something different. Most innovations are differentiated products and are a different product that does something different or better than the alternatives. And when you view patents as such, they are not really, you realize that they're not really protecting monopolies, but they're protecting competitive advantages, or what economists would call creating Ricardian rents. You do something better than the average, and then you get a rent, or you get a remuneration beyond the remuneration that you would get your factors of production would get in competitive markets. So actually, patents don't create a monopoly, don't create monopolies, and moreover, I mean, in many cases, firms don't patent because they don't want to reveal what their secret is, and they don't want to give information to other people who can invent around. So patents, many times, what they do actually is that they contribute to the diffusion of the information, and by doing so, they help new startups to use technologies that, without infringing the competitive advantage of the owner of the patent. So there is a misconception about patents creating monopolies by the fact that they create exclusivity, but that doesn't mean that this is a monopoly. I have an exclusive right to my home because I'm the owner of my home, but I don't have a monopoly in the housing market, right?
That's a very useful way to think about it. Con, please.
Oh, I was going to say, I think one of the great things about this book is that we are sort of, each of us, gravitating away from thinking about patents exclusively as monopolies. We're thinking about it as right to exclude others from certain innovations in a way that enables different kinds of market dynamics. So for the early software industry, one of the things that was very important was trying to create licensing arrangements. And that doesn't necessarily fit into sort of a direct monopoly interpretation of what a patent would give you. And sometimes patents didn't even have necessarily any major commercial value, and they were just ways for firms to assert their identity in the industry, so that later they could say, well, we have this track record of doing this. Sometimes they have a signaling value more than a commercial one as well.
Interesting. So you guys have both mentioned licensing, and I'm struggling with that idea. The vision, let's say, I have of patents is, and I'm channeling, I mean, you guys know me, I'm channeling the alternative view of patents here. patents as monopolies. The vision I tend to have is the vision that, the pharmaceutical industry, where a firm gets a patent on a particular molecule and then prevents alternatives to that particular molecule from being, or prevents copies of that particular molecule to enter the market. And licensing does not necessarily enter into the way that industry works. In sort of the history of Silicon Valley and in semiconductors and the history of software, I think you guys are suggesting that licensing is actually a key, and that, so now imagine, had there not been patents, could you have had licensing? What would have been the structure of these industries? We all know in Silicon Valley, there's a million small firms. They seem to crop up almost every morning. You only have to go to the local Starbucks to hear, three people talking about what they're going to launch. I like to joke sometimes is, I'm going to develop an app that's going to help you find chocolate ice cream, as if, that we don't know what that is already, or where to get it. So I'm wondering what things would have looked like in the absence of licensing had there not been patents.
Well, you only have to go to the second part of the or second period of the semiconductor industry, which starts in the early 80s with fundamental developments in the technology to design circuits until the late 1970s or mid 1970s. You would need to draw a new circuit and a new semiconductor device. So you made a drawing which was made by hand. By that time, drawings were getting so complicated that people feared that the industry would stop in its tracks because it would not be able to deal with this complexity. But then two computer scientists invented a new language in which you could write down circuits more or less like programs. And that basically what that did was to create computer science and chip design as a new discipline. It used to be that chips would be designed by the ones who manufactured them. So chemical engineers are very prominent in the early stages of the industry because it was necessary to produce a chip. You would need to be able to produce it, and for that you had to be a chemical engineer. So patents allowed specialization, and especially, well, from the early years of the industry, but especially after the 1980s. At the same time, you see a trend in the industry in which fabs or semiconductor plants were getting bigger and bigger. They would be getting more and more efficient and be able to do better and better chips, more and more complex chips, smaller and smaller transistors, but at the same time, plants will be going bigger and bigger. So essentially, what happened in the industry is that design became specialized. So you have zillions today. The standard model today is a semiconductor firm that doesn't own a fabrication plants. The industry is very, very concentrated at the fabrication part. But you have millions, or not millions probably, but thousands of different design firms and semiconductor firms that design semiconductors. Had it not been by patents, they couldn't have essentially traded those designs. They couldn't have had credible commitments of manufacturers not to copy them. And what we would have seen is probably a concentrated industry. And if we work backwards and go to the early 50s and 60s, then probably without patents, we would have seen the same structure emerging, which is that semiconductors and semiconductor technology would have been developed by large vertically integrated firms.
Go ahead, Con, would you like to add to that?
Yes, and in terms of thinking about what the industry structure would have looked like without patents and without licensing, I think the clearest example is what happened in the 1960s with IBM. IBM in the 1960s became the country's most vocal opponent of software patenting in all of its forms. They lobbied Congress, they lobbied all sorts of government organizations and launched educational campaigns essentially designed to say that software is a kind of invention that falls outside of the realm of patent law entirely. Of course, that's very shocking given what IBM is like today. But at the time, the reason for this was that IBM, because it was bundling its products, and an earlier consent decree had limited what it could do with its own patents, IBM was essentially hoping to tear down intellectual property protections for software to completely level out the playing field in the legal terms so that its own market dominance could be perpetuated. And so this world that IBM envisioned was one in which software would essentially continue to remain free, where it would no longer be positioned necessarily as that which makes the system valuable. And that way, hardware would be the primary source of value in the computing systems that it sold. And so this was a world in which licensing would be almost entirely non-existent for software. But it would have also been one in which competitors would not be able to enter the industry at all because IBM could just steamroll whatever new innovations they would try to make and sell.
So this is really fascinating. And I wonder if we could stay with this for a few minutes, because what you're suggesting, Con, is that in software, patents were attacked by the dominant player in the industry. Mm-hmm. The biggest firm was anti-patent. And Alex, if I'm hearing you correctly, you're saying something somewhat similar about Silicon Valley, which is that the biggest firms were not necessarily the ones who favored a strong patent system, and who don't favor it necessarily today. So I wonder if you guys could talk a bit about how it is, so the book's called The Battle Over Patents. And so it implies that there's a competition or a struggle taking place, a battle taking place. So could, in each of these industries or in the innovation economy broadly defined, could you guys help enlighten us as to what the sort of, generally speaking, what the battle lines look like? Which firms tend to be pro-patent, which firms tend to be anti-patent, and how did this come to be then how did an intellectual debate emerge out of a fight, which is essentially about what you're suggesting, intra-industry fights over the rents from innovation? How did this even become an academic discussion?
The conflict is, one can describe it as follows. There are specialized firms that essentially develop a technology, and they don't manufacture necessarily, they don't bring this technology to market because they license essentially that technology. And that creates a temptation from manufacturers, of course, and the bigger, the more vocal they are, to claim that they are not really infringing the patents, or that the patents are patenting really useless stuff that everybody knows anyway and shouldn't have been patented in the first place. And we can see that, and I think the book touches upon that in several chapters, in which along the history, this debate has been more or less the same in the same terms. Probably what's new in the last 20 or 30 years is that is that big firms have engaged regulators to, in order for them to weaken the negotiations for royalties. Regulators have been involved in the patent debate for at least since the 1930s, as one of the chapters of the book by Jonathan Barnett clearly explains. It turned out that they weakened patents for a long period, but those patents tended to be owned by large firms, which didn't care much because they could appropriate the rents of innovation through other means. A real battle over patents involving regulators comes from the last 20 years, in which essentially manufacturers have tried to weaken the patents, particularly in phones, by arguing that this intellectual property isn't that valuable, and that innovators are exploiting monopoly power with those innovations. And so the battle is, on the one hand, you have specialized firms that develop technologies who like patents. Some of them are quite large, but not as large, of course, as the manufacturers. And on the other hand, you have manufacturers who would like to have weaker patents, because on the one hand, they would pay less for a while, and that disadvantages smaller firms that can compete them and develop better technologies that erode their rents.
In the software industry, so yes, early on, there was this battle between the hardware manufacturers led by IBM and the smaller firms like Applied Data Research and several others that were starting to try to make inroads in the industry and trying to compete with IBM and the other companies. But these battle lines sort of started to shift. And the easiest way, I think, of thinking about this is not by focusing on the computing industry itself, but by realizing that over the years, say by the 70s and definitely by the 80s, patents started to become valuable in any kind of industry where sort of exclusive rights over some kind of automation could be a valuable competitive advantage. And so when you, following on the themes that you were just discussing, we start thinking about manufacturing and about telecommunications and about all these other companies that start realizing that there is a legitimate commercial and technical interest in securing software patents on their own. But along the way, what started to happen was that the very idea of what software is in a software patent started to become very, very blurry. For mathematicians, for example, the software would be a collection of algorithms, but for an electrical engineer, it might be a specific way of wiring a machine. And for industrial research laboratories, there was sort of this hybrid technology that they were just developing so that they could get somewhere else, perhaps a new way of controlling a telephone system or something like that. And so these conceptual tensions started to develop that eventually attracted academic interest. And then this goes, Steve, to your question of how did an academic debate start to form? But this academic interest started to explode in the 1970s as devices became smaller and cheaper and more kinds of users started to become involved in the computing industry itself. And so eventually we end up with the hobby cultures of Silicon Valley, where the critique of software patents stops being a conceptual one about sort of whether or not we are claiming ownership of something that should or shouldn't fall within Section 101, and it becomes more about control, about corporate control over user interfaces and the degree to which commercial actors should or shouldn't be allowed to assert ownership over the systems that enable people to communicate freely with a machine. And so that really started to build up a lot of the scholarly tensions that continue with us to this day, sort of these social and ideological and cultural critiques of what the consequences of ownership are.
So I want to, this has really been fascinating, but I'm mindful of the time and I want to shift us a little bit because one of the things that the Hoover Book Club is designed to do is not just talk about the substance of research and its policy implications, but also give listeners and viewers a sense of how research happens. So I was wondering if, I mentioned at the beginning that this took us 3 years of collaboration to produce this book, but of course, there was a lot more than that before I even reached out and invited you guys to be part of this. That is where Naomi Lamoureux and I said, hey, well, let's get Alex Galetovic and Con and others together. So there'd been a lot of years of research prior to even beginning to work on the book. So by way of getting across the idea of what research consists of, I wonder if I could ask you the following question. What did you discover, as is in the scientific sense of the term? That is, what did you not know before that was a surprise in the process of doing research? What came to you as something of a shock as you were doing research, and how did it happen that discovery emerged?
I discovered that there is an untapped source of information in the history of patents, and that is the archives of the patent office that are held in Kansas City by the National Archives. So one of the things that I did, especially for this chapter, was that I went to the National Archives and actually was able to study all the correspondence between inventors and patent officials. And I could even trace the colored pencil lines that patent officials made as they read a patent alongside the images for it. One surprising conclusion that this led to was what the chapter that I wrote is about, which is that not programmers, but engineers in the 1950s started to secure patent protections for computer programs indirectly by patenting a machine that worked in accordance with it. And this would allow them to bypass all sorts of legal doctrines that would have prevented them to patent, for example, an algorithm. But there was sort of this intrinsic physicality to what a program was that became essential to the early techniques for patent drafting and computer programming.
Let me follow on this, because you mentioned going to an archive in Kansas City. How long did it? How many documents are we talking about? How long did it take you? Was this a weekend of work, a week of work, an afternoon? How long did it take to sort of read through all these patent applications and correspondence?
I moved to Kansas City for a year and went there every weekday. I asked for, they're called the file wrappers. And at the beginning of every week, I would speak with the archivist and give him a list of all the patents that I was hoping to examine that week. And then he would bring up these enormous boxes where these thick folders were contained, and each folder was a file wrapper. I would spend the first half of that week going through the patents quickly to assess prior art and see if I could actually start finding connections to other patents. So I would keep a running list of potential patents that I could examine later on. And then that was in the Mondays and Tuesdays. And then Thursdays and Fridays, I would spend it comparing patents with sort of the court records, because they also happen to be held at the same archives. So I would spend comparing my notes from the first 3 days with the trends that I was noticing in the court records that were also there. So it took about a year of living with the patents.
Wow. Alex.
Yeah, one of the let me tell about one particular thing that fascinated me that I could understand by doing this research, and then one aspect which is a bit broader about the economics of innovation. One of the fascinating things I thought about the among the many things that are fascinating in the semiconductor industry is this, that you simultaneously, it's like you having your cake and you can eat it. Because it seems that you had all these semiconductor firms driven by the expectation of profit, and at the same time you had an enormous rate of creation of knowledge, most of which wasn't used by these firms and became part of the general knowledge of Silicon Valley and beyond. There is a 1982 paper, short paper by Bob Noyce, one of the founders of Intel and one of the founders of Fairchild, which is a legendary firm in Silicon Valley, who argues that all the industry cannot be understood without this cross exchange of information among semiconductor firms, and yet you have that, that firms were driven by profits that they could appropriate and make. And to me, it was fascinating to realize that patents were at the same time allowing one and the other, because they were solving what has been pointed out in the literature, widely in the literature, which is that the free riding problem is inherent to markets in which you're creating knowledge and information. Second thing is which I find fascinating, and I think going into an industry and looking how this industry develops and how the equilibrium of this industry emerges and evolves over time, is that you realize that we economists have some ways of looking at innovation which probably are which could be improved. It's to me, it's rather ironic that in the same paper by Ken Arrow, which has influenced the profession so much, you can see the treatment of innovation as a monopoly, which has essentially determined how economists think about innovation. And at the same time, in the same paper, Arrow points out to what is called the Arrow paradox, which is that it's very difficult to trade in information, because if you reveal the information, then whomever you're trying to sell the information to already knows it, and so won't be willing to pay for that, right? And then you go to the semiconductor industry, and you see that patents, more or less, solve the Arrow paradox. And one of the hallmarks of the industry is that in the early days, of course today it's so as well, but especially in the early days, the industry realized that they would have to explain how the technology worked in order to convince manufacturers and system companies to adopt the new technology, which was challenging the old technology of vacuum tubes. And you have that here, patents played a big role, because you could go into a trade conference and advertise your technology and tell how that technology worked, because you had a patent protection of it. And so you would solve the Arrow information paradox. And so I think what one of the things I've learned is that there is a lot of fascinating insights to be gained by changing a bit the emphasis from monopolies to all these other things that patents do.
So I'll stay with this for a minute, because this is, I think, very deep in terms of both of what you've sort of raised, very deep in terms of what the academic enterprise is and how knowledge advances. So you both hinted at other things that patents do, but would I be incorrect in saying that we could boil all of the things that patents do is an outcome of the fact that a patent is a property right. And like any property right, allows there to be gains from trade and specialization. And that the battle over patents is as much a battle, one can see it as a battle at two levels. At one level, the battle over patents is a battle about the rents in any industry. It's an intra-industry fight over who is going to earn the producer, which firms will earn the producer rents that come from the product. And it just happens to be the case that the firm that's at the end of the production chain, let's say in phones, it's the manufacturers, they're receiving the payments from consumers. And so now firms that are the innovators that are further upstream, that hold the patents, have to battle with the firms that have received the payments directly from consumers. And it's an inherent tension in this and many other industries, is that there's a production chain or a supply chain, and people are going to battle over the surplus, depending where you are in the production chain. There's another battle, and it's an intellectual battle. It's not over money, at least not directly. It's over how to think about things. And that battle is a battle about, well, what is it exactly that patents do? And so there's sort of two views out there. One is that a patent grants a monopoly, and that we're willing to live with that monopoly because without it, there would be no incentive for anybody to innovate. The other view, which you guys seem to be articulating, is that no, the patent's a property right, and it allows for trade. Most of, and you guys can correct me if I'm wrong, most of, as I understood the developments of in economic theory in the post-war period, tended to favor the view that property rights and specialization were good things. And this is why we have active markets in the United States and elsewhere, and all kinds of products and services, and a tremendous specialization in almost any industry where there's complicated, as we're learning today, complicated supply chains that are made possible by all of the property rights that allow everybody in the supply chain to make a claim on the surplus at the end of the chain. So that's one view. And then there's other view is, oh no, there were patents for monopolies. How is it that in the sort of advances in economic theory, we cleaved off patents as monopolies and thought of them as monopolies and as to be something to be studied within monopoly theory, rather than thought about them more generally like any other property right? Do we have as an intellectual matter, do we have a sense of how this emerged and why it emerged the way it did?
That's a very good question. I think the fundamental insight that a patent can lead to a monopoly, or can be associated with a monopoly, to be more precise, is right. I mean, there can be the both can come together. At the same time, it's much more easier to model or write models with a monopoly than to write models with the idea that specialization works. That's a sort of truth that we take as self-evident, but it doesn't lead to many, necessarily to many and easy, nice models. And I think patents as monopolies lend themselves to modeling. You can model them as monopolies, as oligopolies, and so on. And so it's natural that the profession exploited that vein and to do research. My impression is that at some point, of course, we forgot to ask, what else do patents do? And maybe the things they do are more important than just create monopolies, and they are less prevalent. There should be this comfort in thinking that patents create monopolies. One thinks that every year there are about 300,000 patents issued, and so we would have 300,000 monopolies, maybe fewer of them because some patents never get anywhere, but it's hard to reconcile. And monopolies are very damaging. So if we would have a world full of monopolies, we would figure that out. And I think the profession should take a fresh look at patents and explore all the possibilities that emerge for doing profitable research. If you accept that patents do a different thing, and then most of the time they don't come associated with monopoly.
Well, let me. Can I take a minute here and reflect on what you said, and then I want to invite Con to jump in. You draw a distinction about monopoly that I think is important, and I think that for non-economists, let me see if I can explain what a monopoly, at least is defined in any economics textbook, actually is. It doesn't mean a big firm. It means a firm that's able to constrain output in order to raise price. One could, in fact, have a local monopoly, a not very big firm, but because of, let's say, transportation costs, it has a monopoly in a local area. A classic example is in the asphalt industry or the cement industry or sand and gravel, where because it's expensive to transport this stuff, you tend to get one firm that serves, let's say, an entire county or set of counties, and it exercises a local monopoly. Those of us, anybody who's ever been to a baseball game or a movie theater has experienced monopoly pricing. A $20 bucket of popcorn and a $10 soda is you're experiencing what monopoly pricing looks like, because you cannot bring your own popcorn maker into the movie theater or ballpark, and you can't bring your own soda machine into the movie theater or ballpark, and you certainly can't grill hot dogs in the stands. Security would escort you to the door, and so because there are no substitutes, we get this experience of monopoly. And if I understand what you're saying, Alex, that it was a sort of what we might call a law of the conservation of energy of scholars that allowed us to take that model and apply it to patents, because as a matter of the math of writing down a model of how things work, it was just easier to work from a monopoly than to work from a competitive market, because the modeling, the math becomes much more difficult and intractable. Am I understanding this correctly?
Yeah, I mean, it's a paradox that most patents probably, I haven't done the research for that and quantify this, but I would guess that most of the patents are to protect substitutes of something. And that's the driving force behind patenting, not to create monopolies, but to create new substitutes that don't infringe on existing technologies to solve a particular problem.
Interesting. Con, I know you wanted to jump in.
I do, yes. So I think that the math angle is tempting, but I'm not an economic historian, and so I don't actually have to worry about that. I don't have to worry about whether the math is more tractable if I think of this as a monopoly or not. And instead, the view of patenting that I've developed is more about what kinds of incentives can developers and inventors and innovators be looking for at a certain time. And when these incentives are sometimes commercial, and sometimes they are, as I mentioned earlier, about signaling to their existence and their entry into a market. Sometimes these incentives are simply symbolic. They just want to assert that their company exists. And so this view of a patent as a monopoly, there's of course a historical reason to jump into it. There's a statute of monopolies. It's sort of the connection between the two words is very, very old. But we can ask different questions now. We don't have to keep, at least when we're thinking archivally and qualitatively and narratively, we don't have to keep assuming that a patent is a monopoly, because we have plentiful evidence that it isn't necessarily so. And that's, I think, one of the great things about this book, that it's sort of reminding us there are many different ways in which patents become valuable and in which patents become important.
So yeah, let me just use a visual aid here, I think, to make the point that you just made and that Alex made, which is, okay, so here's a smartphone. And a smartphone has literally dozens of technology companies develop the patents that are inside this phone. Most of those patents are not held by the manufacturer of this phone. They're developed by lots of other companies. And if each one, if I'm understanding what you guys are saying, if each one of those upstream firms held a monopoly, if the patents granted those firms monopolies, then the price of this phone should be priced like a hot dog at a baseball game. Excuse me?
And worse.
And worse. Yes,
Yeah.
right, because there would only be one monopolist at the baseball game.
Right.
Whereas you would have 30 or so monopolies exercising a monopoly over the production of this. And one test of the proposition would be to ask, well, how are smartphones priced? Is there any evidence that anybody is earning monopoly rents? And so it becomes an empirical question, susceptible to tests against evidence. And I don't want to have a spoiler alert, but for those who read the introduction to the battle over patents, you'll find a discussion of the empirical literature on actually what is the value that is not the inherent value, but what is the value that the technology development companies, how much are they actually earning in royalties from a smartphone? And the number, I think, will surprise many of the listeners to this book club presentation. We have a few minutes left, and I'm going to do something that's perhaps a bit unorthodox in the format of these, which is to ask Alex and Con whether they have questions for each other or a question for me. So to really open this up and give a sense of not just where I'm asking questions and you're coming up with answers, but where we're asking each other questions. And so let me throw that open as a last round before we cut off.
So I have a question for Con. What new things do you think can come out of exploiting these archives you mentioned? I mean, you must have seen lots of things that you couldn't work on, right?
These archives became a surprising source of corporate history information. It turns out that companies would file internal documentation to justify certain points. And so whenever, for example, with IBM, which is a company it's notoriously difficult to get into its own corporate archives, I was able to trace certain technological and ideological and commercial trends in IBM's history by following their records as preserved in the National Archives. And so this way, even though it's not going to be a completely full picture of IBM's thinking, I was able to generate glimpses of how its managers and executives thought about patents by following these legal trails that have never been digitized. Some of them had never even been opened. I would be opening letters that they would be sending to each other, and that was absolutely fabulous. So it's sort of new ways of investigating how corporations that are closed to outsiders, how they work on the inside. Yeah. For you, a question is, how do you think about the development of new kinds of intellectual property protections altogether in the semiconductor industry? Because that has been a recurring theme, sort of looking for new forms of IP or IP-like protections that go beyond patents and copyrights and trade secrets. How do you trace that history?
Well, there is an instance of a new property right created by Congress, which was the I don't remember exactly the name, but it was it protected directly designs, but it didn't fly because it was introduced in the 1980s because semiconductor firms were very worried about foreign firms copying the designs and making the chips cheaper and better. And so they passed a law that protected designs, but it was actually never used. I think more broadly, this is a testimony to the flexibility of the intellectual property of the intellectual property landscape that we have available. Not only patents, but also trade secrets and non-disclosure agreements and so on, which is a very complex web which firms use as complements and not as substitutes. And I think, my guess would be that you will see not necessarily new types of intellectual property, but you will see lots of uses of intellectual property which are novel.
Well, this is great. I realize that the hour is upon us. And so I want to thank both Alex Galetovic and Gerardo Con Diaz for their time and for joining us today at this installment of the Hoover Book Club. And I want to point people to the battle over patents, history and the politics of innovation, which you can find both at your local bookseller and, of course, from online book retailers. Thank you both very, very much. And we look forward to the next installment of the Hoover Book Club. Thank you.